Gilly, are you okay for me to start the introductions? I know that there's still people coming in at the moment. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go for it. I'll keep letting people in. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. Well, welcome everyone to this Media and Gender Research Group event. So the Media and Gender Research Group at the University of Leicester, we are an informal network of feminists across the university, but also across the UK and internationally, illustrated by this event and all the faces I can see popping up in front of me. So in precedented circumstances, we'd be meeting at the University of Leicester several times each semester as a supportive, inclusive, collective and generative space to nurture feminist research, but also to cathartically and sometimes despairingly make sense of and pick apart the key challenges, the key feminist challenges that we see in our everyday media culture and social and political context. So because we can't physically be together this autumn, we're really excited to be running a series of online seminars with a range of feminist media studies speakers. And today I'm really pleased to be kicking that off with our first event, which is the launch of Gilly Boyce-Kay's brand new book, Gender, Media and Voice, Communicative Injustice and Public Speech, published by Palgrave. And I'm also pleased to welcome the respondents, Professor Jo Littler from City University London, Associate Professor Catherine Rottenberg from the University of Nottingham, and Professor Helen Wood from Lancaster University. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the event, and we'll be using both the chat box and microphones to be able to do that. This session is also streaming on YouTube at the moment, and you can go back and watch it there afterwards, but we'll be handling the questions here in Zoom. So Gilly Boyce-Kay is a lecturer in media and communication at the University of Leicester. And she's the assistant editor at the European Journal of Cultural Studies. And she is my co-convener of this media and gender research group, although she does a much better job of that than me. She's the co-editor of books, The Wedding Spectacle Across Contemporary Media and Culture, and also The Past in Visual Culture. Her research is rooted in feminist media and cultural studies, and she's written on the topics of gender politics, of mediated voices and public speech. And this work has been published in a range of places, journals including Feminist Media Studies, Media History, and Feminist Media Histories, and also in a number of chapters in various books on feminist media studies and media histories. Her work draws attention to the ongoing and deep-rooted, in her words, broad structures of gender injustice and the continuing subordination of women and other others in public life and culture more broadly. This is the focus of this new book. She's also explored this in relation to coverage of suffragettes in the press, women's talk on television, reality celebrity labour, anger and other topics. It can be really easy to become consumed and demoralized by the sheer despair of these injustices that Gilly spends her time researching and revealing. But in keeping with that commitment that's at the heart of generative feminist cultural studies, Gilly's work manages to accomplish the political goal of instilling hope. Running through all of her work is the philosophy, to quote Raymond Williams, whose work I know she's fond of, is that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. As she puts it in this book, and I love this line, the deep terribleness that we are confronted with is grounds for pessimism, but not inaction. I think we might think here of the possibilities of radical despair or galvanizing bleakness. This is a message we need to hear in 2020. While in the book she notes that it is precisely the notion of voice as wholly individual, masterful, polished, entrepreneurial, competitive, and self-made that is a problem, in Gilly's writing and in countless conversations I've had with her, her voice is eloquent, compassionate, generous, and importantly, hopeful. Now, I wish I could congratulate you, Gilly, in person on the publication of this book. I'm literally a couple of miles down the road, but because of local lockdown restrictions, we can't do that. So I'm proud and honoured to virtually introduce and to congratulate Gilly, my colleague, co-writer, sister, comrade and friend, on the publication of Gender, Media and Voice.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that really, really lovely introduction. And thank you so much to everybody for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time out on a Friday evening when no doubt you've been sat in front of a screen for the whole week. So I appreciate that you're spending an hour or two more in front of a screen. So thank you ever so much. And thank you to the Media and Gender Group for hosting this, and particularly to the invited speakers for being here. I really value and I'm really honoured that you're here. And all of the speakers, all of their work has been incredibly important for my thinking, and particularly in the writing of this book. So Catherine's book on neoliberal feminism and her work on Me Too, Jo's book against meritocracy, and her brilliant article on the mother behaving badly, and Helen's book Talk on Television, and her recent work on the gender politics of irreverent rage have all been really, really important for the writing of this book. So I'm just so delighted and thrilled that they can be here. And I don't want to speak for too long because I want to hear from the other speakers, but I just wanted to say something about how the book came about. And it started life as a PhD many years ago under the supervision of Helen Wood, who's one of the speakers. So her work and her mentorship has been incredibly important and continues to be for me. But the PhD has it's changed a lot from its original kind of its original life as a PhD, which was about women's talk on British television in the 70s and 80s, and its relationship to second wave feminism. And since then, it's become much more broadly. The book's become much more broadly about the gender politics of voice, and this is partly because I became really interested in the ways in which in neoliberal culture we're all constantly being encouraged to find our voice, to join the conversation, to have our say, to use our voices, speak up, speak out, as though voice was just sort of there for the taking, equally available to everyone. And of course, there's been a kind of growing claim in the wake of Me Too that women's voices in particular, and women's testimonies and speech and disclosures were going to transform the world. And some people suggested that Me Too was going to split the world open. And of course, that's not really come to pass. And so there seemed to me to be this sort of growing gap between the spectacular promise of voice and voice as it actually exists. And so I started to think about this concept and develop this concept of communicative injustice. And this refers to the often insidious ways in which meaningful voice is denied in contemporary culture. And I became really interested in longer histories of the punishment of women's voices. So Mary Beard's work on how at the foundational moment of Western civilization in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, at this moment, women's voices were absent by design from the public sphere. So to be speaking in public by definition meant that you weren't a woman, and so femininity became defined by its exclusion from public speech making. And as Mary Beard shows, we're still living with these legacies now, the sort of linguistic legacies of these historic gendered exclusions. But what also became really important in my reading was Silvia Federici's argument, which is that we have to understand misogyny in the context of capitalism. And so she shows how women's speech became much more intensely devalued, despised, and punished at the dawn of capitalism in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's here that we see the rise of the witch hunts and brutal instruments such as the ducking stool and the scold's bridle, which is what appears on the front of the book. And of course, we're now in a new round of neoliberal capitalist enclosures, and also in a new moment where misogyny is again resurgent. And so I think this denial of voice of women's voices has a very long history, but there's a sort of contemporary twist to this ancient injustice, which is that whilst women were once compelled perhaps to stay silent, they are now increasingly encouraged to speak up, and yet are routinely punished for doing so. So while we might not have kind of brutal methods of punishment such as the scold's bridle or the ducking stool, we have online trolling and backlash and doxing and many other more insidious ways of silencing women. And so women then, I argue in the book, are pulled in opposite directions by a culture which impels them to speak, but then punishes them for doing so. So this book is an attempt to think through the difficulties of speaking as a woman, or really as anyone who's not a white upper middle class neurotypical cisgender man. And if women and girls are now compelled to have a voice and be visible, or be confident, as Rosalind Gill and Shani Orgad argue, or to come forwards in Angela McRobbie's terms, or to be empowered, as Sarah Bené-Weiser discusses, then it's necessary to acknowledge the cruel ways in which this impulsion to have a voice is entangled definitionally with exposure to misogyny. So communicative injustice then describes the impossible situation that women are in when it comes to public speech. So to have a public voice and to participate in debate in the public sphere is fundamental to any conceptualization of citizenship and full personhood. And yet to participate in this most fundamental aspect of democratic culture is so often to experience shame, abuse, and humiliation. And as Melanie said, I've sort of always drawn to questions about hope and despair. And the book, as Melanie's already pointed to, ends by trying to grapple with the real bleakness of the moment that we're now in. And this book was written last year, so it's not like things have got any better since then. And it argues that I guess its central argument is that things are actually already worse than we already take them to be when it comes to questions of voice and justice. But in this kind of true cultural studies fashion, it also argues that pessimism should not be equated with defeatism or should lead to inaction. And yes, so Melanie's already pointed to the use of this word respair, and this was an English word that was used in the 1400s, but then fell out of use for many centuries. And it's respair is a portmanteau word combining despair and repair, and it means fresh hope, or a recovery after a period of despair, the return of hope after a period of despair. But I think it can also cue us into the ways that hope and despair often exist at the same time, together, and that we oscillate between hope and despair within a moment. And Sarah Bené-Weiser have written, and I have written about this and argued that this term is especially apt for today's deeply despair-inducing moment. And we suggest that we can think of Respair as a kind of critical feminist hope that does not disavow rage or does not insist on the sort of compulsory mustering of optimism. So I think anger and hope are not antithetical to one another, and actually neither are hope and despair. So a respairful approach to communicative injustice is one that confronts the deep cruelties and irreconcilabilities that characterize the contemporary public sphere. And it recognizes that there is no way that we can win on the terms as they currently exist. So the book argues that the rules of the communicative game are set up in such a way that we're bound to fail. And so speaking up as individuals and working on developing strong voices is fundamentally inadequate to overcome what is a crisis of voice. So the book argues that we need to collectively transform the whole communicative terrain. And this involves, for example, taking back the means of communicative production. And so I think a struggle for democratic common ownership of media and communication has to be central to any politics of voice. And then finally, because we're still living with these linguistic legacies of exclusion from the public sphere, speaking out as women or queer people or trans people or neurodivergent people, working class people, people of colour, often engenders feelings of shame, humiliation, weakness, inadequacy, and we're made to feel like communicative failures. So I guess what should we do about this when we're made to feel like we're failing? And the book argues, and I'm going to swear now, and I have to apologise to my mum, who I've just seen is in here, but the book argues that to fuck up and fail, when this is on patriarchy's fucked up terms, can be reconceived as a way of illuminating injustice and imagining alternatives. So as Jack Halberstam argues, from the perspective of feminism, failure has often been a better bet than success. So gender failure often means being relieved of the pressure to live up to patriarchal ideals. And Melanie Yergo's amazing book on authoring autism shows how the dominant communicative norms that we have are ableist and exclusionary, and she says fucked up. So she says autistic people should not try to assimilate to these norms, but she says to fuck up that which is already fucked up. And I take great inspiration from this. And I think that if our voices are, in patriarchy's terms, deficient and faulty and broken, irrational, unreliable, then we have little to lose. And so I think we shouldn't limit our understandings of what meaningful voice is to, as you know, being able to give a TED talk, and we shouldn't insist that learning to speak in masterful, confident, fluent and polished ways is the only kind of route to communicative justice. So above all, I think communicative justice must be collective. So I think the central struggle should not be to find our voice as individuals, but to fight for voice collectively. I will end it there, but yes, I would just again like to thank everybody. Thank you very much for coming, and now I'm really looking forward to hearing the other speakers. So I will hand over. Thank you. So,
shall I come on now?
Oh, hi, Jo. Yes, thank you. I'll hand over to you.
That was wonderful. Thank you. So huge congratulations, Gilly. Many thanks for inviting me to be part of your book launch. I am honoured. This is a wonderful book. Here it is. Which engages in really dynamic and interdisciplinary ways to help push forward a number of different debates about feminism, media and power. And it really is a really significant achievement. So I first read the book over about a year ago now at proof stage, and I found it a really energizing text, and it educated me. So for instance, I'd never seen some of the 1970s feminist TV shows, which Gilly writes about, such as the programme No Man's Land, featuring an unsmiling Juliet Mitchell and a rampaging audience. And for me, the book brought home a really urgent problem. The fact that in the UK, our ears are disproportionately exposed to often patronising, often selfishly incompetent, posh white men who continue to be presented as our inevitable leaders and our social fathers in so many spheres. Whilst at the same time, the voices of women, of others, of those directly affected by inequalities and cuts, such as now key workers and carers, who are disproportionately female, are heard far less. And I really loved how it digs into the complexities of which voices are enabled and listened to, how it emphasises that it's not just a matter of telling individual women that they need to find their voice, but of transforming the wider communicative terrain. And I think one good recent example of this is how the lack of older women in the BBC is coming again under renewed scrutiny. So you might have seen the story the other week of Libby Purvis complaining about it. And in the terms of Gilly's argument, you can't tell women over 50 to lean in when they're being fired for having faces that are too lined or voices that are deemed inappropriately mature. So I read it a year ago, but I've been thinking about it again this week in the run up to this event as I went back to the book to refamiliarize myself with it. And I was thinking about how this is quite a different social and academic context from when I first read it. Now we're in a time when so many of us are rarely meeting face to face. Our voices are mediated through these online technologies. And if we're lucky and if our institutions are more responsible than the government, we teach through them too. So we're acquiring different ways of using our embodied voices, recording lectures whilst having to gaze at our own reflections like Narcissus, communicating between mediated domestic spaces with our eyes not quite meeting. And at the same time, it's interesting, I think, how quite a few female students have told me that they like online learning better and they feel more able to speak up because we're all the same size on the screen. As the book reminds us, contemporary media architectures present new and complex challenges as well as opportunities for feminism, and we're navigating an ever-changing present. So I was really happy to come across a passage in the book this week about normalized cultures of overwork in academia and the realities of difficult cognitive work, the realities of brain fog. It felt very appropriate to me this week. And I liked how Gilly considers the pressures that are on academics to be always on in our performance of cognitive authority. So Gilly asks, and I quote, "If academia privileges voices that are slick, polished and performative of their own authority and devalues those which are not, then what kinds of knowledge might end up being lost? What are voices that are less assured, faltering, awkward or neurodivergent?" And I think this argument that we need to widen what is counted as important speech, what is given credence, is a really vital contribution of the book. It's wonderful at highlighting the complexities and the intersectional character of whose voices are given prominence. There's a great chapter that examines the racialization of misogyny, how Diane Abbott is framed on Question Time, the misogynoir of that. And it complicates an over-easy celebration of female anger as feminist power by showing how it depends on context, showing how it depends on what the anger is being channeled through. So she talks about how Katie Hopkins, for example, uses gendered anger to spread racist hatred. And by showing how vocal power is classed, by bringing in crip and queer theory, by considering how women's voices function in relation to violence and trauma. I particularly like how the book revisits gendered tropes like the nag, the catfight and the gossip by tracking their histories alongside the specificities of the present and its power dynamics, or the conjuncture, as we love saying in cultural studies. And what is crucial, I think, in the book is really its argument that voice is, like Gilly said, is not just a matter of individual expertise and power. The book really dismantles that notion. And instead, it emphasizes how the collective voices of women, as well as the collectivity that women represent, is key. It argues, to me, wholly persuasively, that we need to collectively take back the means of communicative production, like Julie said, from a neoliberal patriarchy that continues to exploit us. And some of the questions that are prompted for me by the book, which would flow for that, are about how you might push these issues forward. So I guess some of the questions would be, how might we dramatize and amplify all these problems? How might we do that in different ways at a time when media ownership is profoundly concentrated and being driven rightwards politically? Could we find ways of connecting these wonderfully nuanced readings to campaigns to democratize the media? And you indicated that you'd like to see that, Julie. How might we bring them together, this kind of cultural studies nuance, together with political economy, that the media approaches to work that people like Natalie Fenton are doing? And how might we use digital media to push for more democratic, gendered forms of media, whether perhaps developing grassroots or local forms of media, or using union media potential, for example? So I'd be interested in talking about that with you sometime, Julie. And finally, to wrap up, as the book reminds us, we're only effective when we work for the common good and try to figure out productive ways of working together. So moving beyond the book a little, I think this is also one of the strengths of Julie's work as an academic and as a human. It's evident in, for example, how she's been developing the Cultural Commons section in the European Journal of Cultural Studies, and in how she provides a supportive environment for gender and media academics, whether on the virtual or physical picket line, or by developing WhatsApp groups during lockdown. So thank you, Julie, for using your voice inside and outside of the text.
Thank you so much, Jo. Thank you. I think.
You want me to just take?
Shall I hand over to you, Catherine? Thank you.
So I also just want to say how thrilled and honored I am to be here this evening and to be part of this panel with Helen and Jo and Melanie and Julie. It's such a huge pleasure to be able to discuss gender, media, and voice. And yet it's really hard to come after the three of you. So what I want to do is first celebrate Julie's book, brilliant book, which I've read cover to cover twice now, once in order to blurb it and now in order to respond in more detail in this forum. And each time that I've read the book, I've come away with new insights. And then in the spirit of generative feminist engagement, I also want to offer some ruminations and raise some questions. So as I've said, gender, media, and voice is brilliant. It's beautifully crafted, it's rigorous, it's compelling, and it's utterly convincing. And it's also an important book for feminist theory, for cultural studies, and for feminist media studies, among many other fields. And it's an important book for many reasons. So here I'm just going to point to some of the ways in which it's influenced my thinking and raise some productive questions for me. And on the most general level, the book's importance derives from its contribution to our understanding of the gendering of voice and speech in our mediated public sphere. And it offers us the insight that when women speak in the public sphere, they are, and here I'm quoting from the book, symbolically registered as being out of place. This insight is so simple, and yet it is so powerful. And this being out of place is, of course, inflected by other axes, such as race and class, while we also know that the cost of speaking out is much less for white, middle-class, cisgendered women than it is for the others. And the reason for this out of placedness, as the book reminds us, is due to the historic association of women with the domestic realm. Indeed, not only is the public-private divide constitutive of Western liberal democracies, but women's association with the private sphere is also constitutive of these democracies. And in many respects, this linkage accompanies us to this day. And here I'm quoting again from Julie. She writes, "The punishment and humiliation of women who dare to speak out has not been an aberration in the development of the Western liberal democratic public sphere, but has been foundational to it." And here, Julie is drawing on feminist political theorists from Nancy Fraser to Wendy Brown, but Julie takes these insights in order to investigate the communicative public sphere, sites such as as television, debate, and daytime talk shows, Netflix, and social media, and the particular kind of, or kinds of, gender injustice and gendered violence that take place in and through these mediascapes when women speak. Now, we've, as Julie introduced tonight, communicative injustice has a very long history, and it's tied with the public-private divide and the gendering of speaking in the public sphere. And yet, as the book reveals, it has also taken on new forms in the contemporary age of mass communication, first radio and television, and now social media. So while the notion that gender inequality is baked into our conception and inhabitation of public space is not new, the question of voice and how we understand, how we hear, how we respond to women speaking in our public mediated or mediated public culture is. And as I understand it, or as I see it, the key intervention Julie makes here is that we cannot understand contemporary culture and its injustices without exposing the inequalities in language use and public speech. In other words, we cannot struggle for social justice without fighting against communicative injustice. And I think this is such a crucial point. And then this leads me to another critical intervention, another important contribution, is that Julie's excavation of the gender politics of voice media culture, particularly since the 1970s in the UK. So for instance, as we heard from Jo, she examines the content and response to the UK debate series No Man's Land. It provides much needed historical context. Her historical explanation provides the backdrop for understanding the shifting communicative landscape today. After all, social media, as we've heard, appears to offer a much more democratic voice, quote, seducing and entrapping us with its powerful promise of equality, end quote. And yet, following feminist media scholars such as Sarah Banet-Weiser, Raz Gill, and Shadi Orgad, Julie convincingly argues that the cultural imperative of our contemporary moment appears to promise us voice while urging women in particular to speak their anger, to speak their trauma. And this is epitomized in many. Somebody just muted me. Who was I speaking? So Julie calls this the celebratization and popularization of women's anger, highlighting how this is a new twist in contemporary culture. So where once women were compelled to stay silent, today they are increasingly encouraged to speak up and out and even to rage. But as the book reveals, this imperative is a double-edged sword, and the book shows us how the contradictions and paradoxes that emerge are inextricably entangled with the gendered logics embedded in the public-private divide. In other words, this speaking out has come with new forms of gendered cruelty and abuse. And as Julie pointed out, both in the introduction and also in the book, of course, she writes, in the contemporary mediated context, women must brace themselves for misogynistic responses, which are both pervasive and insidious. So yes, you can express your anger, you can express your trauma, but also prepare for backlash. Women speaking out, though, of course, cannot be simply equated with progressive change. And Julie provides the example, as Jo mentioned, of the right-wing media personality, Katie Hopkins, who advances alt-right Islamophobic and white nationalist politics. Moreover, given the larger neoliberal capitalist context in which women are speaking out, women's voices are often atomized and individualized, impeding rather than encouraging collective action. So if the communicative terrain on and through which we articulate our grievances tends to reproduce gender inequality, precisely given its history and its constitution, then it's never going to be enough for women simply to speak out. Speaking out will always be an insufficient condition for effecting social change. Rather, as Julie forcibly argues, if we want to work towards communicative justice, then we must radically transform our communicative apparatus by, quote, redistributing the means of communicative production. She wants, in other words, to socialize and democratize the power relations informing the communication production process. So I want to just reiterate how impressed I am, Julie, by your meticulousness, by the fascinating and rigorous analyses that you offer of the different media sites, and the clarity with which you construct your theoretical framework and build your argument. I am also completely aligned with your overall political claim and agenda, namely that to work toward communicative justice, we must insist on the collectivist nature of feminist voice and the vital importance of grounding it in a left critique of capitalism and racism. So in the last few minutes, I just want to turn to the final part of my response, which is where I want to ask a set of questions and offer a set of ruminations. Voice, speech, talk, public speech, vocal speech, speaking out. In the book, these are invoked and sometimes used interchangeably, even as Jilly herself calls herself out for doing that and emphasizes that we cannot reduce one to the other. So one of the things that I'm wondering is if we can think a little bit more about what the particularities and peculiarities of each of these terms are. It seems to me that they are indeed different, with different inflections and even political valences. And this is a related and maybe a completely off the cuff and associative question, but it's around voice and whether it may still be important to distinguish between voice, that material and irreducible uniqueness of the human voice, as the Italian feminist Adriana Cavarera has argued, and speech, and how we might then distinguish between these two terms and the notion of collectively speaking out. Again, there seems to me a different level of political mobilization valence here that we might want to think about. And another question is how we understand precisely the relationship between communicative justice and social justice. There are points in which you seem to distinguish communicative justice and social justice. So then the question is communicative justice one aspect of a larger struggle for social justice, or is there something much more fundamental about the struggle for the redistribution of the means of communication that makes it absolutely essential to any social movement, social justice movement? And I think you're arguing the latter. So then why distinguish communicative justice from justice itself? And finally, as I argue in my own work, there's a way in which neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalism erodes any remaining distinction between the private and the public spheres. And here I'm thinking particularly of social media and the further blurring of private and public speech or talk. So I wonder, does this change in more significant ways the ways in which women's voices emerge and are heard in our contemporary moment? Can we say that being out of place holds to the same degree or in the same way when women speak out on social media in our neoliberal era, when the public and the private leak into one another, and when the very distinction may or is increasingly unintelligible? Does the taint, in other words, of women's link with domesticity resonate on social media in the same way? Or are there new dynamics at play here with a very inability to distinguish between private and public talk facilitates both more women speaking out and the amount of vitriol hurled at them? So something about the breakdown of the public and the private would be interesting to talk about. So I'll end there. And Helen is next.
Just trying to give Catherine a little clap. I'm a bit slow with the technology. Thank you, Catherine. That was brilliant and also very difficult to follow in terms of being the next speaker. I mean, thank you, Jilly, for asking me to speak at this event. I feel very honoured. I feel very close to the project, and yet as though the project has taken such an amazing, brilliant life, far beyond what I could have imagined when we started out doing a PhD. And it's so representative of you as an intellectual. You're so curious, you're so looking across other fields, you're so looking for other answers from other places. You're a brilliant cultural studies scholar in that sense. You're not confined, you're not constrained. The fact that the work looks at neurodiversity and autism, which I don't think we've done properly in media studies, I think is a testament to your brilliant intellectual curiosity, which will only enrich the field. And I feel very privileged to have had any connection to that along the way, which is brilliant. So the book has moved into so many different places. It takes a historical dimension. It looks at forgotten television. It looks at Netflix. It looks at social media. And I think it's brave in that sense that it's trying to say something bigger about this argument about voice, that is both about the mediation of voice, but it's both about the histories of voice and the histories of gendered, what Gilly calls gendered communicative injustice. And I suppose for me, as I read it, I just kept thinking what this does to the field, really, what this does to anything we might think of as feminist media studies and media studies more generally. And I want to just touch briefly on some of the things it made me think and some of the things it made me reflect upon. I think what the book did is, for me, is reinforce the need to account for historical legacies that establish the terms of communication at all, before we even think about their processes of mediation. You know, the fact that misogynistic trolling exists at such a scale is also precisely because there are available in our lexicon, and here I'm talking mostly about the English language, many, many more abusive terms directed at women than there are at men. This is already laid down. And I think sometimes in media studies and feminist media studies research to look at the new, we forget that we're talking about communication per se. And I loved your reference to Nancy Fraser's use, pulling out of the way in which the word testimony is related to testicle, which I never knew. Who knew? So, you know, these kind of fundamental things about language, which is the terms at which we communicate at all, are already inscribed with so much injustice. It reminds me that the very terms of interaction itself are already based on gendered, race and class ways of enacting inequality. So inequality is performed and enacted in all of our interactions. Institutional structures of power already call other subjects other than middle class cis men to speak in very specific ways. So, you know, in some of my work, I've talked about the ways in which the working classes have been asked to claim poor relief. The way they've been asked to tell their own stories in order to claim poor relief has been institutionalized and passed on to forms like reality television. So these histories are really important, and I think it's rare in feminist media studies to think about mediated communication as part of the unjust terrain of communication per se. And this book does this so well. I think it highlights this blind spot of feminist media studies so well. And you know, the connection between feminist linguistics and feminist media studies, I think, I've long thought ought to be more clearly made. And thank you, Gilly, for doing that and for doing it so well. The second point I really want to make is that the other important point the book shows up for me is how many of the assumptions about the democratic potential of the media framed by mainstream media scholars, I'm not going to name them, we probably know who they are, ignore this basic fact of this already unjust communicative landscape, that the terrain of communication is already fucked up, already enacting power and inequality, means that we shouldn't be using phrases or thinking about phrases which celebrate interaction, dialogue, participation, speaking up, engagement, as though they're already neutral terms. Gilly blows that apart. This is not a neutral playing field at all. And also, the problems in the way in which much media studies makes claims for the democratic potential for media and its attention to the way which transformed by spectacle need to be then rewritten with Gilly's work in mind, with exactly the kind of social justice agenda rooted in older legacies that Gilly describes. I mean, I just read the book and again thought, there is this depressing and enduring problem of publicness for women that seems to be not going away. It's tied inextricably to the pressure of women bearing the weight of the aesthetic sex. And it feeds into the space that they can occupy before she's even enabled to situate or give voice. And there are many examples, and we've talked about it before, of the degradation of public women if they don't conform to an aesthetic standard, which bears heavily on race, class, and different kinds of bodies. And if you think about the attacks on women, you know, brilliant articulate women like Mary Beard before she even gets to speak. And the theoretical attention, I think, given to ideas about the transformation of spectacle in the public sphere, barely, to my mind, give us any purchase on this dilemma. We give us any purchase on this dilemma for women. So I think the book is asking us to rewrite some of the traditions of media studies, actually. So we'll let them know what they need to do. The other thing that strikes me reading the book, and it's great when you read a book and think, oh God, yeah, why didn't we think of that? Is the why we have not more clearly understood these problems with this insistence on fluent, individualized, assured forms of speech, the kind that we're told to make sure we do for ref, the kind that we praise in our political leaders, why it's the kinds that we praise in academia even as well, why it's taken a kind of critique of neoliberalism and now in Gilly's work on ableism, to see this as potentially dangerous. I mean, we know, don't we, that the art of persuasion, from all those early books on propaganda and advertising, that the art of persuasion is a dangerous form, that persuasion and rhetoric often conceals its ideological position. It conceals sometimes what it's really saying and what it's really enacting. And we know to beware the gloss of advertising from the very earliest inceptions of media analysis, yet rarely have we connected our commitment to ideological critique to these forms of legitimated masculinized speech. So why is it that the form itself has not been addressed as particularly ideological and closing off of alternatives? And I think Gilly does that really, really, really well. And I know, and as I've said before, and like Gilly, I am always looking for a bit of hope that some of this is having some currency right now, that there are conversations, perhaps with the rise of popular feminism, as Sarah's talked about, that we're having conversations about things like mansplaining and manterrupting. And now men are often saying, I'm not going to mansplain, but I'm going to tell you this. So it is in kind of common parlance, and maybe that's progress, that there's a kind of understanding of this communicative justice in the contemporary public discussion. And I've talked a bit about trying to use the word fuck to wrestle back ideas around the power of a restricted speech code, that maybe it has some inherent power, which has been a very personal moment of thinking about things for me in terms of my working class education and background. And this week I was really interested to see that you can get a t-shirt that says, "I'm speaking," in response to Kamala Harris's repeated refrain in the vice presidential election debate last week, as a woman of colour speaking back to Mike Pence. Yes, that she needs to say this is depressing, but that it circulates as a meme and hopefully circulates across other kinds of terrain, maybe, is perhaps pointing out and circulating some of the grounds of communicative injustice that we might say for a long time have gone hidden, unrecognised, or, to use Gilly's brilliant phrase, cultural gaslighting. If you point this out, you know, you're told to be to be moaning or nagging or not recognising your own role in what's just happened. So maybe there are some signs of hope in that there's some kind of public discussion about communicative injustice beyond what we can see here. And so I see the book as a call for all of us to call out communicative justice, but also to try and think about communicating in alternative ways, perhaps drawing lessons from literatures in neurodiversity, which I find fascinating and a brilliant addition to the debate. And it strikes me that why aren't we thinking, when we're trying to think about alternative media and alternative forms of communication, it seems obvious that we should be thinking in these terms. We should be thinking of breaking open rhetorical forms and normative forms of the ways in which Gilly's described. So the book asks us to think about speech then in a much more collective sense, and a collective sense that's tied to social justice. And I would agree with Catherine's formulation there, that it feels to me like we need communicative justice first to establish the grounds of all the other forms of social injustice. This is the way in which we're going to work it out. And so I think it seems fundamental to any form of ensuing social justice. And when Jill is trying to get us to think about moving away from this very individualistic form of didactic performance and rhetoric, she uses this word, and I think she knows she's using it a lot, but she uses the word teeming. This kind of teeming voices, as crowded and bustling rather than singular and didactic. And I like that because it reminds me of the phrase teeming with life. And teeming with life signals interdependencies, relationships, other forms of really lived experience, and lives worth living and lives worth speaking about. And what we're getting at the moment is the form of voice which cannot capture alternative forms of life. And it is that kind of trying to find a way in which the mediated landscape can do that, which I think is the challenge. So for me, this kind of struggle for communicative justice must be a struggle to recognise interdependencies, and to come back to one of the themes that Jo and I are both attached to at the moment. It's to try and struggle for a more caring regime, I think. And it's a caring regime that I know Gilly doesn't just write about, she also lives. And I'm very proud to have been part of that journey. That's me done.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone. They were all really wonderful and thoughtful and fruitful responses. And thank you once again, Gilly, for writing this book and giving us, all of this ground to discuss and raise questions and talk about today. So I'm going to open it up to the floor now for about half an hour or so of questions. So I'm used to using Microsoft Teams, which has a raise hand function. Does Zoom have the same thing? Oh, there is a raise hand function. Yes, excellent. So there's the raise hand function. We've also got the chat box. I'm going to try and keep my eye on everything as best I can. We already have a question. So Marela, am I saying that right? Sorry, correct me if I'm not pronouncing names correctly.
Marela,
sorry, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for all of this, and thank you, Gilly. Gilly and I have been friends since our first days undergraduates at Cardiff, and then I guess our friendship was reconfirmed when in the late noughties we both committed the cardinal sin for middle-class women under neoliberalism, which is to have children before we had permanent jobs. I haven't read all of your book yet, Gilly, but I'm looking forward to it, and I really enjoyed reading the introduction. As a Renaissance scholar, I was another kind of version of the sort of historical words that you've mentioned, those various histories of negative representations of women's anger, I suppose, that came into my head was the scold. And, no doubt it comes up at some point. But in that context then, and I guess with my other interest in contemporary culture, I was thinking about the word woke scold as it's used on social media as a term to deride a certain kind of complaint by a certain group of people who aren't necessarily women, but of course the term is used in a gendered way. So the idea that people are slapping other people's wrists for not using discourse properly, whether it is in terms of gender, in terms of race, or whatever else. So I was just wondering what you thought about it in general. So I'll leave it there.
I have not really like come across this term. So it's so it's this idea that people are being kind of admonished for not being woke enough?
That's right. So that the group of the in crowd of the woke are telling people off, and it's people who don't consider themselves to be part of that who use it as a, you know, as a complaint about woke scolding. So I guess woke scolding, and you know, and I'm sort of, I guess I'm on the fence about the usefulness of the term, but I'm not necessarily saying that I'm against it. I guess the term indicates that somebody is using woke language and the ideas of wokeness in order to tell other people that their points and the whole existence indeed sometimes is illegitimate. And I guess it is used in a feminist context. So I guess, okay, you're right, there is another kind of secret question in the back. And I guess it's perhaps something to do with whether in the context of the space that is opened up under neoliberalism, especially for middle class professional women, and the way in which recently on social media a certain kind of discourse, quite an extensive discursive space is opened up for complaint, whether there is actually something in that idea of woke scolding being a dead end, so that a kind of effective mongering of righteous anger actually ends up not serving any of the issues, you know, at stake. So I guess Me Too would be the most obvious example of that, but I guess it also has other, you know, other purposes, and it comes up often in terms of race, etc. as well.
Wow, thank you, Marila. You always ask me questions which really challenge my thinking, and maybe I might come back to that just because there's quite a lot to talk about. And but I guess the whole kind of like context of, I guess, what's been called like the kind of, you know, the Great Awakening, or the kind of wokeness industrial complex, in which, you know, I guess popular culture has become in some ways more kind of like apparently sensitive to social justice concerns. I guess in the book, I guess I'm very kind of ambivalent about the potential of that. That I guess that you know, this greater kind of sensitivity to questions of diversity and kind of representation does seem to me to have some kind of potential, but is sort of, I guess, just sort of fundamentally limited and constrained by, well, I mean, I guess just by not being rooted in kind of left politics. So I guess my sort of quite simple and maybe not very satisfying answer to that would be that I think those kinds of things are potentially useful, but if they're not kind of like rooted in a kind of broader left materialist politics, then they're extremely limited. And I guess that's the kind of overall argument of the book, is that, well, and I use Nancy Fraser's kind of distinction between the politics of recognition and the politics of redistribution. And I think you know, these kinds of types of actions which lend themselves more towards kind of recognition and representation and so on are, you know, they're not to be dismissed, but if they're not also connected with a kind of you know, if they're not rooted in the left and in left politics and materialist critique, then that's the basis of their limitation. So I don't, does that answer your question? Just
yeah, no, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you, Marila. Thank you.
So we have a few other questions. So Michelle, you've got your hand up, and then I know that Tamzin does have a question after that, and then we can go to some of the questions in the chat box as well. So Michelle, go ahead. Or if not, we could go straight to, oh, sorry, go ahead. No, let's go to Tamzin next. Michelle might be away from the computer. Tamzin, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, it's just nice to see everyone as well. Hi everyone. I wanted to ask, thank you, Ginny, for that. It was so interesting, and all the yeah, I've written a lot down and lots to think about, and I haven't read the book, but I'm really looking forward to it. But so I'm really interested in this question of new sort of civic spaces for engagement, and it was sort of like coming about with this concept and this discussion around social media. And just as Catherine was talking, I sort of had this memory of when Twitter, and like, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Twitter, sort of in the early days of Twitter, like certain journalists like Grace Dent and There's No Relation and Caitlin Moran talking about it as a women's space. Did I get, like, I just had this vague memory of this was like meant to be, this is a women's space, this is about communication, this is talking. And I just wondered if, is anyone tracking a shift, or is there any notion of shift between when, how a space is conceptualized as being feminine or feminized, if you like, and the kind of journey to it clearly not being so, and that it being a space for violence and injustice and that sort of thing. And I know that the language pre-exists it, but that conceptualization of how it can change from one that's meant to foster communication in a reparative way to one which is very much not so.
Sorry, can I just want to make sure that I understood your.
Yes, okay.
So sorry, was this thinking of like a particular kind of space? Sorry, I might have missed the beginning of the question, sorry.
Yeah, I was talking about Twitter to start with, you know, but social media, like, how do spaces go from being I guess reparative or offering potential to an awareness that they're not, or that they can be harmful?
Oh, okay, thank you. Oh yes, well, I mean, I guess I'm really interested to know what other people think about this as well. But I guess, well, in my kind of way of thinking, which is that, you know, to be incredibly pessimistic, is to think that those spaces were never a kind of just or equal or I guess space in the first place. And I guess, I don't know, I mean, I guess the kind of argument which I guess I make in the book is that on the terms as they currently exist, in the conditions as they currently exist, sort of meaningful voice or kind of, I guess, a kind of reparative or generative space isn't yet possible, and so it's about sort of somehow kind of fighting for those conditions to exist in the first place. And so I mean, I know that, you know, other people have written and know the sort of architecture of Twitter much better than I do. And Richard Seymour's got a really interesting book about Twitter and social media and the way that it sort of tends to function. And but I guess, and I'm sorry, I know it's not really a kind of maybe a very satisfying answer, but I guess it's just the idea that voices is there, that there are spaces that we can kind of retreat to or go to. I mean, I guess I think it's just useful to think, okay, those spaces don't exist yet and we have to build them or fight for them. And I guess that would be my sort of my pessimistic answer. I'm not sure if that does answer your question, but I guess that's what the kind of the book argues, I suppose.
I know that Michelle's mic is working. Got disconnected just a little while ago, but Michelle, would you like to go next with your question?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. First of all, thanks to Gilly, to a book that I'm really looking forward to reading, and to the other presenters. There was so much here that fascinated me and so many questions I wanted to ask. I think what I'd like to do is take you back to the idea of respair, which is, I was fascinated by that idea because I've been working recently on using Janet Newman's distinction between hope as collective and aspiration as individualist, and been thinking of that in the context, I think it was Jo and Catherine's work on conceptions of feminist solidarity. And it seems to me that if you take those things, then the idea of voice or teaming, which is another wonderful word, seems to be absolutely essential for the kind of growth of solidarity. It seems to me that the solidarity we need in order to affect change may be dependent on affecting change in order to promote solidarity. Sorry, that sounds like one of those terrible moral reflection. So I just think in terms of the respair that you're thinking about, how far is that a very conscious resistance to the individual exhortation to voice? And I research with girls, and you see this very, very strongly with kind of all kinds of messages that are coming at girls, that you can do what you want, but you must have voice. It's hugely individualistic, and I'm wondering how far respair is framed in more collective terms.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So I guess, well, I guess respair is a way of trying to kind of to rethink hope, which isn't part of this kind of kind of resilient, optimistic kind of I can do it by myself kind of narrative, and to think about how like Helen was talking about, the kind of that recognizes the sort of interdependent nature of human relationships, and sort of tries to cultivate hope, I suppose, in it, whilst recognizing that the conditions for social mobility or human flourishing are not available to us. So I guess it is about kind of trying to think about, well, I also think Terry Eagleton's distinction between hope and optimism is quite useful. So he says that that the optimism is almost like a kind of like fatalistic kind of idea that, well, things will just get better on their own, whereas hope is a much more kind of sort of like recognizes that you actually have to work towards, that it actually takes hard work, and it's painful, and it's difficult and messy and complicated. And I know that Jo's work with Wendy Brown also recognizes this idea that that hope should be more about kind of grit than it should be about rather than hope, we need kind of grit and determination. So I suppose respair I find really useful and generative, because it recognizes that that hope is work, and you can't, it's, and you need collective relationships to help you sustain hope, because the situation is so bleak and terrible. So and I mean, I guess sort of respair is offered, I suppose, as a kind of speculatively, I suppose, to so I'd be really thrilled to think that would be a way of sort of other people sort of developing this sort of notion of, I guess, a hope which is sort of collective but teaming, and I know that Jo and Catherine's work on solidarity talks about the need for solidarity which is rooted in left politics, but also pluralistic as possible. So I think that to me seems like the sort of historic task of feminism is to cultivate solidarity whilst having this sort of whilst retaining this kind of the sort of teeming difference and pluralism of of humanity. Sorry, again, I feel like all of my answers are very sort of not a sort of more questions on top of questions, but I guess I would love to know what other people think about the sort of possibilities of respair as a sort of way of of making hope possible, I suppose, in Raymond Williams's terms.
I think this goes to show how generative and fruitful the work really is. I know we've got questions in the chat box, and I don't want to sort of overlook them. So Charlie asked, from a museum studies perspective, how your book's message of collective transformation might translate into something like gender representation in museums, heritage and culture. So I don't know, Charlie, if you'd like to come in and expand on that, or Julie, you have any immediate thoughts on that?
I'd love to know more from Charlie if Charlie's willing to share a bit more. not having sort of expertise in museum or heritage, I'd wouldn't want to sort of venture an answer, and I guess would be very interested to know what somebody from that field would think. So I mean, I guess just looking at the question, I suppose, well, again, I think I just sort of go back to this sort of like question of you know, insisting that sort of politics of representation and gender representation, I guess, in museums, as an example, would also have to be connected to a kind of a kind of materialist struggle to ensure that museums are properly funded, and that, you know, and the arts and culture are not kind of, you know, intentionally decimated as they are being at the moment by the current government. So I guess that would be my answer to that question, is that I think obviously, like, gender representation and the politics of representation in spaces like in museums and in art and media and so on is obviously incredibly important, but that always has to be connected with, you know, a kind of an economic struggle to, you know, well, to redistribute wealth and power so that those kind of resources are available to everybody. And yeah, so I hope that answered your question again. So I think, yeah, the different dimensions of justice, which are about representation, but which are also about material redistribution, I think are what we kind of have to keep together to ensure meaningful voice and meaningful justice of all kinds.
We have a question also in the chat box from Rachel, who says that most of the conversation so far is focused on voice in the public sphere. So she's wondering how much of this carries over into the private sphere, and she's thinking about how communicative injustice manifests within families and intimate relationships.
Oh, yes. That's very interesting, and I guess the book is focused on public speech primarily. I mean, I guess what I could say maybe is that the book sort of thinks about how something like nagging is, I guess, you know, nagging is a form, I guess, the ways in which women's voices are construed as nagging in a domestic context, I guess, is a way in which communicative injustice manifests in the domestic sphere, and you know, with, you know, not just sort of discursive consequences, but you know that the implications of this are, you know, lead to, you know, extreme forms of violence and are linked to domestic abuse and so on. So I think the book doesn't think about actually how it plays out in those contexts. And I know that, you know, feminist linguists do write about the ways in which you know, because women's voices are construed as nagging, that can be seen, you know, as a way to sort of like legitimize or excuse violence against women. But I guess all I could say really is that the book thinks about how those kinds of, the ways in which the women's voices, when they sort of appear or are heard in the public, are, you know, still, I would say, bear the sort of taint of that kind of you know, the sort of the idea of the sort of the nagging housewife, the gossip, these speech modes which are associated with the private are kind of taint the ways in which women's voices are heard in the public sphere. But I don't know, maybe somebody else would want to say something about that, because as Catherine was saying those very interesting things about, you know, this kind of public-private divide, and maybe would have something more to say about that than I could think of now. Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
I think that the question is is addressing a different kind of, a slightly different kind of issue. And my sense is that when you're thinking about certain traditions in Western liberal democracies and the ways in which certain voices have become, have maintained their dominance. And yes, the part of the puzzle is in fact the private sphere, but the public sphere has always been the sphere of meaningful voice in quotation. So I think that it raises a set of questions about the private versus the public and the way they're constituted through one another, which you also talk about in the book. But I think that really thinking about that question, it's what you're addressing in the book is a different set of issues, even though they're very, very related. I mean, that would be my way of thinking about it with you, Jilly, and thinking about, you know, how do what constitutes sort of dominance and hegemony in society, and it's clearly related to the ways in which the public sphere operates. So I'm going to shut up, but that would be sort of a way of thinking with you about that question. And
thank you.
Maybe I'm totally wrong.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. Melanie, did you say there's more in the...
there's a couple more questions in the chat. So I'm going to go to Ariel's questions next, but just before that, Charlie has posted just a little response. They've got a very noisy environment, which is why Charlie can't come on mic at the moment. But Charlie's just completed some research on how museums are moving away from exclusive procedures and exploring how to display the female voice and how contemporary activism affects this. And what was most prevalent in Charlie's research was that there is a challenge in presenting female voice and the idea of a women's exhibition. So Charlie was interested in seeing how your idea of collective change to a female voice could work in that context. So that's just a bit more sort of clarification for the previous question. So Ariel has posted a couple of questions. So first of all, asking what the relationship is between communicative justice and media justice, but then goes on with a more sort of expanded question, asking if you think that the feminist counter public sphere and alternative feminist media, and really the evolution of all counter spheres, might be models or guides for transformation of the dominant capitalist sphere.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. That's a really, really important point. And I think so the book, it does really focus on kind of, I guess, mainstream media, mainstream popular culture, and thinking about how communicative injustice kind of operates in that sphere. But of course, yes, I think the kind of alternative media and kind of oppositional public spheres are, provide that kind of potential, maybe kind of prefigurative ways of showing how how different conceptions of voice may come to be. So I mean, I guess maybe that's a kind of a limitation of the book, is that it's kind of pointing out the problems of what's happening in mainstream popular culture without considering, I suppose, that what's all the activism and work that's going on in actively trying to cultivate different kinds of space and more collective forms of voice. So I mean, I think I would just wholeheartedly agree that these can be models and guides for the transformation of the dominant capitalist sphere. I guess going back to kind of what Joe said at the beginning about how the fact that we are seeing kind of the concentration of media ownership and media becoming kind of less democratic in many ways, points to some significant challenges. But I think it's always really important, to centralize and amplify the work which is going on. So I would just very much agree there, that that's incredibly important. And I think the other question, sorry, was about media justice. Was that right? Sorry, I can't see it in the
Yes, so what's the relationship between communicative justice and media justice?
Oh, wow. I guess it's, well, I guess this brings to mind Catherine's question as well, which is about what's the relationship between communicative justice and social justice. And I suppose I'm sort of ambivalent really about kind of the how useful it is to sort of to sort of like think about all different forms of injustice, when really, you know, I guess we could just continue to think about, you know, economic justice and gender injustice and so on. And I know Natasha Whiteman's book, who's here this evening, kind of cautions against the sort of endless proliferation of thinking of, you know, new forms of capital or new forms of the gaze or new forms of justice. And I guess, but what I would say to that maybe is that I think there's something distinctive about communicative justice, which differentiates it from maybe social justice and media justice, if I'm in the way I understand media justice. And I guess that's that in social justice, more broadly, there's often a kind of an assumption that talk is a kind of neutral resource which is equally available to everybody, or which is not kind of already inflected by its own kind of power relations, as Helen was talking about. And I suppose, I guess there's just a way in which we associate kind of democratic speech itself as kind of as being like masterful and polished and confident and charismatic. And I suppose what I find maybe, what I think is maybe one of the most important things to think about is how people that speak with different voices, or who don't speak, who are non-verbal, or who have communicative disabilities, I just think in the kind of current ways in which we imagine social justice and voice, there's just a real exclusion of people that don't speak in the ways that we associate with, you know, being a great speaker. So, you know, in the book, I sort of think about how, you know, we associate kind of democratic speech or ideal speech as, you know, being, you know, looking people in the eye and speaking very fluently and speaking in a very kind of rational and linear kind of way. And I suppose I've just come to think that that's actually a very exclusionary way of thinking about justice and about social justice, and that we just sort of like need to get better at valuing different kinds of voices. So and again, I'm really sorry, I feel like I'm not directly answering any of the questions, but, you know, just posing more questions, but I guess that would be my response to that in particular.
We do have a few more minutes if anyone would like to jump in with some final questions or comments. I don't know if any of the respondents want to jump in here as well and come back to anything, but we do have a little bit of time.
Just a quick point. I really love the idea of Gilly and Charlie putting together an exhibition about voice, gender. You should definitely do that. And it was making me think about how there's a really interesting tradition of feminist activism in museums and galleries, from the work of Mel Lademann's Ukeles, the artist who, when she had a baby, was thinking about all the kind of types of social reproduction which aren't visible in the gallery space, and she did this performance art where she's called maintenance art, where she scrubbed the steps of the gallery in New York to draw attention to that. And then there's the Guerrilla Girls and Galdem more recently. So yeah, that could be a really great exhibition. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we'll have to get in touch, Charlie. Were you looking at the chat box, Melanie, or are we?
I am, yes, and I'm just trying to keep up with all the lovely messages as well, just to in case you haven't noticed, you've got lots and lots of really lovely congratulatory messages about the book, which just shows how great it is and how brilliant your work is. So there's, yeah, really lovely messages.
Thank you.
Oh, and Beth has just asked a a quick question. Oh, and Sophie's got her hand up as well. So Beth asks if you find significant differences between spoken and written voice, or live and non-live voices in relation to your research. And then we can go to Sophie for one final question.
Oh, thank you, Beth. And I think in the book, I think, and I mean, I think Catherine's point here is really significant as well, about sort of differentiating between the kind of, you know, what we might mean by voice and speech and communication. And in the book, really, I don't think about the kind of different forms of spoken and written. I certainly don't think about written, you know, voice in the kind of in the written sense. And I guess that's something for me to think about much more, actually. And somebody mentioned this already about, you know, how yeah, I think maybe it was Catherine, that, you know, that what happens to the politics of women's voices when they are expressed, I guess, through kind of written forms, because, you know, Twitter is essentially, you know, social media is essentially a kind of written, you know, it's about writing, it's not about kind of the, you know, the spoken language. So I guess that's just something I think I'm going to have to think about a lot more, and thank you for kind of raising it, because it is, you know, does raise really important questions about, you know, as the communicative terrain is changing, and certainly teaching. I don't know if other people who are teaching students have found students, now we're teaching online, most students want to type their responses and want to engage through writing rather than through speaking. So I guess it's so important to think about how these changing sort of technological and communicative forms are, you know, what implications they have. So so I guess thank you for the question. And then I think Sophie had
yeah, it's Sophie's got their hand up. So Sophie, would you like to?
Hello. Congratulations, Gilly. I, like Marila, I've known Gilly since she was an undergraduate, so very proud of her this evening. Well done. You've left me with a lot to think about, and possibly quite a depressing weekend, as I think that hope is work. So thanks for that on a Friday evening. Perfect. I'm going to ask you a really, what should be a really easy question, because you've had a lot thrown at you from academics, and I'm not an academic. So I'm going to ask you about, you talk about the overwork in academia. You talk about always having to be on as a cognitive authority. And in a way, I don't want to ask the question, because even asking it is a little bit sexist, because would I ask a man? But what is your advice for somebody trying to write who is as busy as you?
Oh, thank you, Sophie, and thank you so much for coming as well. I mean, I was thinking about this, and I think I was wondering about, you know, whether it's actually important for us to talk about, like, how difficult it is to write books, and how sort of painful and, you know, very in a context of overwork where we don't really have space, where we don't really have space to think. What does that mean for the sort of like for intellectual production? Because I guess, you know, I'm very, very proud of the book, and I'm really pleased with the way it turns out. But I also wonder what it would have been like if I'd have had more time to think about it, more time to write it. And in the end, I was writing it on my phone on a Google Docs app, and I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, and I would write on my phone, because that was the only time that I could get before the kids woke up and before the sort of day started. So I guess I would say it's well, I guess to go back to the sort of like the sort of recurring, but it seems to be my response to every question, is that I think that what we should do, rather than sort of like give advice on how to write a book when you're incredibly busy, is to fight for better conditions, working conditions, so that people are able to write, and are not, you know, and particularly like precariously employed academics, of which there are many more, and of which, you know, the situation is getting so much worse. you know, I'm really worried about what the implications of that will be for, you know, for knowledge production, for hearing the voices of, you know, incredible academics who are not kind of able to spend time writing, to develop their thinking, and all the necessary things that there are for writing books. So I guess my answer would be that we need to sort of, you know, fight collectively for better conditions, more equal democratic conditions, so that everybody has time to write a book, if that's what they want to do. So I hope that answers your question, Sophie.
I feel like that's a lovely way to round up the event, actually, ending on that sort of collective hopeful note, which I think is such a key strand running through all of your work, Gilly. So thank you for that. And you've got some more lovely comments in the chat box, congratulating you on the new book. So I just want to say congratulations again on the publication of this book. And this event has been a joy, and I'm really excited for the rest of the seminar series that we have coming up this semester. Although maybe we should not call it seminar series. I know that you've highlighted the meanings of various words and where they derive from, and I think seminar might also be one of those manly words. Yes, but thank you, Gilly, and thank you to all our speakers, Jo, Catherine and Helen.
Thank you so much
for taking part as well, and for everyone coming here. This has been a really nice event and a lovely way to kickstart the seminar series. So
I really appreciate it. Thank you, and to all the speakers for your time and wonderful contributions, and for explaining the book in terms which I never could, and making me think in all lots of new different ways. And thank you to all the questions as well, which have been really challenging and generative, and yes, and hope to see everybody at future events, and everybody's welcome to join the media and gender group, so get in touch if you would like to be on the list, and yes, everybody's welcome. Thank you, good night. Oh, I have to see if I can. Oh, I'm going to stop the live stream. Who's okay? Great. Thank you so much, Catherine and Jo and Melanie and Helen. Thank you.
Well done, Gilly. That was tiring for you.
I just had this.
You're not on YouTube.
Sorry, no, I've stopped the
Stop YouTube. You have
stopped the recording.